Let me start off by saying that Ilan Troen's new book, Israel, Palestine in World Religions, Whose Promised Land, offers one of the most original perspectives and analyses, indeed, to my mind, the most original perspective and analysis of the Israel-Palestine controversy. While most studies deal with the topic from the point of view of political history and competing nationalisms on the one hand, and some take into account historical and contemporary religious factors and theology on the other, Troen shows how intimately and intricately intermeshed these factors are, sometimes complementing, sometimes contradicting each other, sometimes both at the same time, in both manifest and subtle ways. And he put it in his introductory chapter, and I quote, "In argumentation over claims to territory, the secular and the religious are not hermetically sealed or necessarily antagonistic to each other. They can coexist," end quote. The book is divided into three parts: the secular claims, the theological claims, and lastly, Troen's concluding reflections on their entirety. On how these play out up to the present, this is the summation in the book. In part one, he provides a wide-ranging and in-depth review of secular argumentation in the debate based on the rights of conquest, once seen as an undebatable right, discovery, or in the case of Palestine, land of Israel, rediscovery, rightful acquisition of land via purchase and labor, and finally, arguments of history, including indigeneity and historical bonds in their many variations. Although today, justification of territorial rights based upon conquest and are dismissed on current moral grounds, Troen points out that the British conquest of Ottoman Palestine in World War I, at that time, gave it legal possession to the territory, just as other territories were gained by Allied conquerors, and particularly in the Middle East, to govern and create mandates for future independent states. I would point out that a number, indeed the majority, of the independent states created have been anything but stable in history since then. Both Jews and Arabs accepted the British as successors to the Ottomans. However, the Arabs of Palestine were adamantly against the British implementation of the Balfour Declaration, which they viewed as a betrayal of them as the legitimate indigenous inhabitants of the country. And over the century since then, they have developed a narrative counter-history which exists in a number of different versions. Inter alia, claiming the Jewish biblical narrative is false, and at the same time, that they are the direct descendants of the pre-Israelite inhabitants of Canaan, the Jebusites. And in still other versions, they are the actual descendants of the ancient Israelites, not the Jews of today, who are not an ethnic people at all, but merely adherents to a religion, and are from many places, particularly Europe, or in another popular version, descendants of the Turkish Khazars who converted to Judaism in the Middle Ages. These are in particular the arguments of Christian Palestinians, And we should remember that it was Arabic-speaking Christians in the 19th and early 20th century who created and fostered the very notion of Arab nationalism in the Levant. Arab nationalism in the wider sense, not just Palestinian, but there was no Palestinian nationalism at the time. And this was part of their encounter with modernity and a way to cast off their more restricted status as Ahl Dhimma, as protected subjects in traditional Islamic society who belonged to permissible religions but had an inferior status. And by the way, it was the Arabic-speaking Christians, I hasten to add, in the region, very often what's referred to as Greater Syria, basically Israel, Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon in the modern context, that the Arabic-speaking Christians in this region were the ones who fostered and propagated modern anti-Semitism, which they acquired from European religious and cultural missionaries. Now, although in modern secular thought, purchase, working, and developing land is a justification for perception, as Troen points out, that the Zionist reclamation of the historical land of Israel is rejected by opponents, both Palestinian and their international supporters, as a form of settler colonialism, a phenomenon that is now held in disrepute. And he meticulously analyzes, exposes, and shows the inapplicability of this skewed and perverse argument, which can be found not only among political polemicists, but among academic ones as well. And I don't have to tell this audience that academe is filled with polemicists, and our field is certainly no exception to that. My colleague Alan Arkush, in his recent review of Israel-Palestine, called Troen's critical expose of this specific topic as constituting perhaps, and I quote again, the most concise and cogent demonstration of this unfortunately fashionable accusation now available in print, end quote. Now, I've focused most of my comments on the treatment of secular thought and argumentation in this book, but I just want to turn in my final moments to one aspect of the section on religious thought, specifically that of Islam, my own special area of interest. Now, while both historic Christianity and Islam never doctrinally envisaged a Jewish return to the land of Israel as a possibility, Troen argues that modern Islam has none of the variations on this subject that Christianity now has, which runs the gap from classic supersessionism, which Jews basically, they may have had a divine right one time, but that has since simply been lost with the coming of Christianity, of Christ and Christianity. But from classic supersessionism to Protestant Zionism, and as having worked in the Bible Belt for 20 years. Um, I became acquainted with not only dispensationalism and post-dispensationalism and pre-dispensationalism, which now I have a better grasp of. And he notes that modern Islam is, and again I quote, far more unified in its opposition to Zionism than Christianity, end quote. But that being said, he also sees in Islam, like other great religions, having place for other ideas outside the dominant mainstream, which allow for accommodation with reality. And he points inter alia to the Abraham Accords, to the example of Mansur Abbas of the northern branch of the Islamic movement, and the latter's participation in an Israeli government. And I would add to this groups like Pacifia in Egypt, which try to foster Jewish and Muslim, Arab and Israeli understanding. And I might comment, had me speak on one of their webinars, which they wanted me to explain why there was anti-Jewish sentiment in the Arab world today. I would point to the numerous messages that I have received from Arab and Muslim colleagues since October 7th, since the terrible days of October 7th, expressing their disdain for Hamas and their concern for us in Israel. And I've received such emails from Morocco, from Algeria, where my interlocutor wrote under a pen name due to the difficulty of the present regime there, Tunisia, Egypt, Turkey, and the Gulf. And lastly, I would just point to the historical examples of the Ottoman sultans, who were the caliphs of the Dar al-Islam, who in the 16th century welcomed large numbers of Sephardi exiles and allowed some 10,000 to settle in the land of Israel, Palestine, among other things, doubling the population of Jerusalem at the time, and giving a patent to Doña Gracia Mendes and her nephew, Don Joseph Nassi, to rebuild and to have possession of one of the four holy cities of Tiberias. Like Ilan Troen, I believe we should not be unrealistically optimistic for the short term, or indeed for the relatively foreseeable future. But on the other hand, we ought not to surrender to hopeless pessimism. And I would now like to turn the floor over to Yael Aronoff, who will be the first of our panelists to speak. Please.
It's such a pleasure to be here. For those of you who haven't read the book, I really recommend it, and I think there'll be or are copies here as well. But it's a very innovative and persuasive and extremely timely book. I think it's even more timely now than probably when Dr. Troen actually did most of the writing and research for it, as I think delegitimization of Israel is probably, and its very existence, is probably at its worst point now than it's been since before the Oslo process in the 1990s. And the book is really a tour de force in having us better understand the theological and secular arguments that embed the assumptions and the argumentation, I think, against Israel's existence and the way these influence one another. And And he examines, as was just pointed out, the secular principles of conquest, self-determination, discovery, treaties, labor, purchase, and history that Zionists have employed, as well as the challenges to these that run parallel to theological challenges. And I think one of the innovative things is, at least as a political scientist, most of the literature that I see is really based on kind of a more secular analysis coming from historians and political scientists and international relations scholars. And often there is no mention, or it's to the complete exclusion of the influence of religious assumptions and varied interpretations in this. So I think it really is a rich, a thorough understanding that brings these two together. And it brings together, in a certain respect, too, the ideas from religion of supersession, the theological ideas, as well as the secular ideas of supersession, whether it's kind of we're in a post-nation-state world, et cetera, that serve to undermine the existence of a Jewish state and a state for all its citizens. So these are intertwined and run parallel to each other. And he gives lots of examples of how different arguments are infused with both, including kind of looking at post-colonial studies and sometimes the integration of liberation theology as just one example. So I think they're very interesting intersections. He does have this argumentation against a lot of the assumptions of settler colonialism, and states that in some respects, if you buy into this argumentation, to some degree, it almost inevitably brings you to the point of trying to get to a radical procedure where you can excise from it, in his words. So he's bringing the religious connections and assumptions and that have largely been ignored, and he says they've also been ignored by the United Nations in their very long exposition of the history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. He also does kind of a really interesting integration of the importance of indigeneity and the debates and challenges about that, and the problems that are inherent in asserting kind of sole indigeneity for any people. And so he describes, of course, the Jewish connections and argumentations. He describes some of the Palestinian challenges that dismiss Jewish indigeneity in the region, and also try to build upon kind of their own kind of ancient lineage in terms of Jebusites and Canaanites. I know for many of you who are teaching in different campuses, a couple of weeks ago we had Indigenous Peoples Day, which I think is an amazing holiday to supplant Columbus Day and very much needed in the United States. But on some campuses that went along with a kind of statements also implying kind of that Israel is a settler colonial state that is subjugating the sole indigenous peoples there, who are the Palestinians. So that kind of argumentation is very much in the current discourse at the universities and across the world in terms of assertions of settler colonialism and a sole indigeneity. So Dr. Troen points out kind of the many ways in which Jews don't fit into this categorization, whether it's their return, whether it's the labor they use that's different. Obviously that they weren't, they're refugees themselves, not trying to empower and bring kind of economic kind of benefits to a home state and empire. He brings in lots of kind of interesting scholars like the British Fieldhouse, who in his seminal work on colonial empires doesn't mention Israel as one of them, and points to the League of Nations and the UN kind of accepting in some ways Jewish indigeneity. So he brings these arguments in, but also brings in kind of the UNESCO rejection of that Jewish indigeneity. And he talks about kind of how in the 19th century, 1900s, you have kind of a immigration, so to speak, not only of Jews to the area, but also of Bedouins and other Arabs from the Ottoman Empire and so forth, and therefore complexifies kind of the unitary kind of linear line of any group in terms of its points of immigration into the area. And he also really points to with the Palestinian Israeli vision statement, I think in 2007, as well as argumentations about Bedouin rights, how they have often also rested on increasing kind of argumentation that centers on kind of soul indigeneity and that rejects Jewish indigeneity. And he looks at all these streams of thought in different aspects that play into this arguments over who has more legitimacy essentially in the area. And I think that's what's the crux of his book is, of course, about legitimacy and arguments about that. In terms of criminalization, he talks about different ways that Israel is criminalized. And I think that today, at least, someone who's teaching at a university campus, as many of you probably recognize as well, you see an increasing, a dramatic increase in, I think, the acceptance of the idea that Israel is committing genocide, which started the week of October 7th. I know on my own campus at MSU, there was a student government resolution the week of October 7th that accused Israel of genocide, didn't mention Hamas or anything like that. And so that has, from that week, kind of grown in consensus. And so I think that some of Dr. Troen's work kind of comes from this origin kind of story, which tackles indigeneity and tackles settler colonialism and kind of the legitimacy of Israel or the lack of its legitimacy at birth, that through theological and secular arguments that then until today in various forms and not in a linear fashion kind of strengthens or influences the challenges to Israel's legitimacy today. I might kind of just kind of throw out the notion that, and I think Ilan Troen's book is even more important, given the challenges that have grown this year. But I think when I look at some of my students, most of whom are not from the area and don't know as much history about it, when one comes to the point of accepting the genocide argument and that kind of criminalization, I think you can also move from today backwards, that if you think the country is responsible for the greatest evil any country can commit in the world, then you can work back and have a much easier time accepting or bringing in some of the arguments that Ilan Troen talks about in his book to kind of justify, well, it must have been evil from the get-go. So rather than a chronological from the 30s or 20s or 1948 on, I think it becomes a backwards logic as well in terms of starting from a criminalization today that then goes back into rationalizing and looking at arguments from the past. So one of my questions to Ilan for discussion is if he can elaborate on the links between the basis for delimitation that work perhaps backwards chronologically as well as forwards. Perhaps increasing phenomena that Israel was born in sin that damns it from the get-go, but rather that its current genocide kind of works backwards, or the challenge of genocide. Then I think there's another phenomena that bolsters the assumptions that Dr. Troen masterfully, I think, discusses in terms of the mutual influence of the secular and religious understandings. And that's kind of the psychological tendencies that we all have for cognitive consistency, and the fact that some in their relation to looking at people and ideas may go towards cognitive rigidity or seeing ideas and people in a binary fashion, right? So part of what Dr. Troen is looking at is the variety of interpretations in terms of both secular argumentation and theological argumentation that different people or individuals can have agency to pick from at different times. And again, if you start from 48 or before, or you start from the current accusation of genocide, in order to have cognitive consistency and to kind of, if you think, the state is responsible for the most evil a country can ever do, then for cognitive consistency's sake, you're also going to be picking up on these other elements, or if you tend to see the world in a binary fashion. So do all these elements work together? If Israel's committing genocide, then one can turn to settler colonialism and be influenced as well by the latent, anti-Semitism. And of course, it's a given that the vast majority of criticism of Israel is not anti-Semitic. But when you look at some statistics of the past couple of years from the American Jewish Committee, you'll find that 85% of Americans believe at least one anti-Semitic trope, and 20% of Americans, which I think is over 50 million people, believe at least 6 anti-Semitic tropes. So likewise, some of these, you have things that you can borrow from if you think that the state is committing the worst evil that any country in the world can commit. You have things that can borrow from and influence those arguments that you can, again, pick and choose from that may or may not be linked, some of them, to kind of theological assumptions and explanations.
5 more minutes.
Okay. So one interesting thing to think about is, when Dr. Troen talks about settler colonialism, he argues that one of the, part of the arguments among some may lead to an inevitable conclusion that you, in a sense, have to do away with a Jewish state. And the same thing could be applied when looking at the accusation of genocide. Is there an inevitable kind of streaming there that it has to be influenced by these other assumptions and arguments that are in Ilan Troen's book? Because even with cases of genocide, in most cases, people don't actually expect or demand the dissolution of the state that committed that. So is there something going on here, right? And I'm not talking, I don't think it's an accurate accusation. That's just something I'm thinking about as I read the book. Ilan Troen also talks about kind of the internal dynamics in Israel that can influence legitimization. So the book is largely about the external, I think, challenges to legitimization, but he also mentions some internal ones. And of course, it's been a long-standing debate in Israel to what extent Israel stands alone, or to what extent it can be accepted among other countries in the world, and to what extent it actually has any control over that in terms of its own policies. So he says that even though the League of Nations, the United Nations, accepted the Jewish indigeneity argument and some of the arguments, of course, for the nation state. But he also says in the very last page of the book, the current moves by powerful members in Israeli polity seem to base Israel's claims and policies primarily, if not solely, in divine intervention. The internal threat is to replace the pluralistic, multi-ethnic Jewish democratic state with a state anchored in religious principles. So he was kind of, in an earlier conversation, mentioning that if the current composition of the government, which includes Smotrich and Ben Gvir, had been the ones advocating for a Jewish state before it was created, whether they would have even have garnered the legitimacy for that or not, and certainly calls that into question. So there are, calls for resettling Gaza, and Netanyahu was kind of having built them up in the first place, and also resting on his own interest for political and personal survival. There's obviously something the government is doing that doesn't justify the challenges, but certainly plays into the increase in challenges in terms of also the lack of faith of many Israelis in their own government. So when you look at delegitimization, ultimately is the greatest threat kind of internal or external, and how do they influence each other? And that's, I think, something that's really interesting to discuss that comes from the book itself. Troen does conclude that a two-state solution is necessary and will aid, in a sense, in regaining legitimacy around the world, and therefore does, in a way, state, although that's not the thrust of his book, that Israel's policy also have a role in legitimacy gained externally. Troen points to increased emphasis in religion in secular societies and in democracies. So he does this within Israel itself, but also in other countries. There are some others who have, talked a little about that, including Alan Dowdy in Israel Palestine, I think, talks about religion being kind of increasingly a fourth kind of path of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But he also points to the varied Jewish interpretations, Christian approaches to choose from, and also talks about narrower but Muslim and recent but growing significance of also acceptance of Israel, whether it's the Saudi peace plan, which 26 states have accepted, and the majority, 57 states of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. He points to the greater accommodation from Mansour Abbas from the northern branch of the Islamic movement in Israel. And even though he doesn't still accept the legitimacy of the Jewish state, this certainly is against violence and for multiple narratives and listening. And he visited in 2021 synagogues that had been destroyed and so forth. So one thing to look at, I think, is there are some scholars who claim that if you attribute scholars who also condemn terrorist acts, against Israelis, who would say if you give prime or sole rationale for that to Islam, that can lead into Islamophobia. But you saw on one hand, you don't want to completely ignore religious influences, which I think Dr. Troen is successfully doing. On the other hand, you don't want to go so far to attribute it mainly. And I think that Dr. Troen does a good balance of trying to balance these things where it's not ignoring religion, but not necessarily saying that everyone who conducts things is necessarily primarily motivated or exclusively motivated by religion. Okay, so I'm just going to end with a few kind of questions for discussion as well. Could more be said about the parallels and connections between internal and external forces? Whether acknowledgement of legitimacy of the Jewish state is necessary for peace or necessary for acceptance in the world. So I think it's an extremely important and timely book, but one question that doesn't challenge the importance and contributions of the book is how vital is legitimacy? Can it contribute to existential physical threats? For instance, if today's students reject support for Israel or even its existence in the future, is this part of the is this going to contribute? Does it rationalize or contribute to physical existential threats? Is it part of the long-standing debate, internal debate in Israel as to the importance of acceptance? You have kind of on one end, that legitimacy can actually contribute potentially to the physical destruction of Israel on one end, or on the other end, is it just a matter of wanting to be liked in the world? That's the other end of the extreme, right? Is it really necessary? Is it really necessary even to be accepted as a Jewish state, right? With the initial peace negotiations with Rabin and with Barak and others, they didn't demand the acceptance of a Jewish state, but its recognition. Later, that became more of a thing. So I think the book begs a lot of questions in terms of legitimacy itself. That begs the questions. It prompts great discussion about the questions of how important legitimacy is and how, there's kind of different, on one end, that it's just a matter of people liking you and whether that's important. It's been an internal debate in Israel. And the other end, where it actually contributes to kind of physical, existential threats.
Thank you very much. Any other further questions, let's leave for the discussion at the very end.
Yeah.
I now would like to turn to Professor Jacob Lassner. Please, Jack.
As someone who is rapidly approaching the age of 90, I have discovered that I'm incapable of speaking extemporaneously. And as a result, I have to write out my remarks in full to be read. And as someone who is approaching the age of 90 rapidly, I've also discovered that I have trouble reading the notes that I have written out in full, all the more so because we don't have any light at this particular table. This will result, no doubt, in certain humorous gaffes. There is the intention of injecting a certain amount of humor into this talk, and I expect that you'll be able to recognize the difference between both situations and respond accordingly. Let me say that I had originally chosen to focus my remarks on chapters 5 and 8 of Ilan Troen's important new book. Chapter 5 deals with claims, mostly Arab claims, to the Holy Land, a justification of territorial sovereignty based on a historic past linked to the concept of indigeneity. That is, claims based on primacy in a geographical area with well-defined historic boundaries, be they real or imagined. Chapter 8 deals with the modern situation and the manner in which Muslim Arabs invoke a distant ancient Near Eastern past to legitimize Arab claims to Palestine in the present, that by claiming the ancient Canaanite peoples mentioned in the Bible are their direct ancestors. Read in tandem, chapters 5 and 8 reinforce the current need to link Palestinian identity to the inhabitants of ancient Canaan, because these peoples were reportedly settled in Canaan before the Israelite conquest mentioned in the biblical book of Joshua. They are considered by Palestinian intellectuals and their supporters to be the indigenous peoples of the land. Therefore, their descendants, the current Palestinians, have a better claim to the land than the Zionists, those intruders from beyond who initiated a modern conquest of Palestine, as did the biblical Joshua. Now, I originally planned to review this issue of claimed indigeneity, but given the constraints of time, 15 minutes or less, I decided almost at the last minute to shift my focus to the misleading commentary on the ongoing events in the Arab Middle East today, with specific reference to the Palestinians and their supporters, whose public discourse, often expressed with great intensity, raised the passions of reading or listening audiences, be it a serious audience trying to make sense of the daily news reports, or a vociferous body of Palestinian supporters chanting rhythmic slogans or displaying such slogans on various placards. This attempt or trend to interpret highly complex historical situations deeply rooted in the past with simplistic moral and political judgments, often expressed in Western academic jargon for which there is no reliable equivalency in Arabic, words such as ihtimal for tolerance, Arab for Arab, Dunyawiya for secular, Yahud for Jews, and more recently, Ahali and Baladi for indigenous. I note in this respect Bernard Lewis's quip that describing the Middle East refracted through the historic lenses and languages of Western societies is the equivalent of describing American football by the rules of British football, which is, of course, soccer. That being the case, one can easily mislead attempts to understand the current situation without consciously attempting to leave these cultural baggage and descriptive language at the door. But how many so-called experts, let alone inquisitive observers, possess the intellectual tools necessary for understanding when and how Arabic vocabulary translated into European languages loses its semantic equivalent, or have the deep knowledge of Islamic civilization required for interpreting rapidly unfolding developments in the area? Some of these events, properly understood, and the operative word here is properly, require an in-depth knowledge of the origins of Islam some 1,400 years ago, and the course of Muslim-Jewish relations before the rise of political Zionism in the 19th century, or for that matter, the issuing of the Balfour Declaration, or the British Mandate, or the creation of the Jewish State of Israel. Speaking of Jewish-Muslim relations, I refer to visions of the past as they approximate states of historical conditions or highly imaginative constructs that have become part of the historical consciousness of most, if not many, Palestinians. Without the ability to embrace the past, there is simply no current way that analysis can acquire the necessary context to reconstruct essential elements of the past. and its residual effects on the present as seen by traditional Muslims, and the key word here is traditional. For all intents and purposes, all the major players among the Palestinians, particularly among Palestinian Muslims, are tradition bound, at least in public. There are no avowed secularists among them, as that word is understood in the West. One will never find a public servant, let alone a public leader in the Islamic world, representing a state, sitting and eating a ham sandwich washed down with champagne in front of a closed cafe during the months of Ramadan, when there's an obligatory fast. The same, of course, cannot be said for various Israeli public figures who revel in consuming all sorts of forbidden foods, and also have to be told how to instruct them, have to be told how to perform when they're called upon in synagogues to accept the honor of having to say the blessing over the Torah. So nevertheless, there are among many Western individuals who follow current events in the Middle East, those who underestimate or even deny altogether the impact of religious sensibilities on the conduct of current politics in the Arab-Muslim heartland. That holds true even when judging the behavior of Palestinian Islamists whose political aspirations have been infused thoroughly with religious sentiments rooted in historical consciousness that is deeply informed by a triumphant past. For the Islamists returning to Islam, there is the belief that the triumphant Islam of the past will be somehow reconstituted and will lead undoubtedly to the end of the political and cultural encroachment of the West, as well as political Zionism, a movement which altered with Western assistance the idyllic relationship between Muslim authorities and their subservient but highly appreciative Jewish subjects, also the Islamists claim. In sum, for the Palestinian Islamist movements and their supporters, the past is the guide for the present behavior, and what Arab Muslims can anticipate will take place in the future. This does not allow me to expand on this view of melding the past and the present, and how it has been criticized as an analytical category by so many who dabble in explaining the politics of the modern Arab world. Who then are the people that shape our knowledge of the Middle East, and how reliable a guide are they to actual events taking place? Or put somewhat differently, how is it that the serious general public, that is, the public that approaches events with a more or less open mind, how are such people ordinarily informed of recent developments in the Middle East's zone of conflict, particularly the headline-grabbing events since October the 7th? Now, information is often obtained via the media. I refer to figures of TV and radio and the talking heads, which consist of the usual subjects seemingly drawn from a central casting agency featuring a field of journalists, ex-military, former diplomats, and the habitué of various think tanks of various merit. For most informative of these guests, the most informative of these guests tend to be high-ranking government officials with considerable experience in the art of diplomacy and or war. What they may lack in substantive knowledge about Judaism and Islam is offset by insight born of extended experience and nurtured by a highly developed sense of historical intelligence. Far less reliable are those players who have limited roles in the art of intelligence assessment, but who are nevertheless utilized by the media to explain complex developments they lack the background to fully understand. Some of the worst commentary comes from individuals whom I would describe as public intellectuals. Their claim to detailed knowledge is obtained by reading selected English language sources from which they draw far-reaching conclusions. Then there are the various journalists who have frequently visited the region, picking up tidbits of information at bars frequented by local informants and interviews conducted with allegedly well-placed political actors who reveal truths to them anonymously, truths which are then treated with the equivalent of a reliable rabbi certificate declaring foods kosher for public consumption on Passover. It would serve us well to acknowledge that as a rule, and in contrast to the general conduct of diplomacy, where truths are expressed privately and falsehoods find currency in public discourse, official Arab spokesmen and public interlocutors tend to tell the truth in private and tend to lie in private and tell the truth in public. Now consider Yasser Arafat singing the praises of the Oslo Accords, which he labeled the peace of the brave in public. This demonstration of support for Oslo, which he shared with well-meaning non-Muslims in search of peace, and did not interfere. This position did not interfere with his comparing the accord of the peace agreements of Hudaybiyah, while delivering the khutbah, that is the sermon, at Friday prayers before a throng of Muslims. The iconic leader of the PLO referred to a well-known incident of early Islamic history when the Muslims, unsure of victory, concluded a peace treaty with their enemies, only to revoke it when they felt confident of success. Unfortunately,
5 more minutes.
For Mr. Arafat, Israeli Arabists, well-read in early Arabic historiography, knew only too well that the Peace of Hudaybiyah was a sham. Now you might ask, why take up limited time to speak of a single incident that took place in the 7th century? If nothing else, Arafat's comment on Hudaybiyah points to the need for familiarity with historic context. I'll end these truncated remarks by returning to Ilan's work. The great stress of Ilan's book is recognizing the importance of historic context and, above all, making it accessible to a wide reading audience without compromising scholarly content. There is the danger that, lacking broad-ranging knowledge of an all-important past, the so-called academic experts in the history of the modern Middle East and their acolytes recruited from the student body will propagate a highly tendentious view of Palestinian-Israeli relations, a view that obliterates the long history of the Jews of Arab lands and serve recent political objectives more than enlighten the public. I, given time, would have preferred to talk about the background of self-identity among Palestinians in the pre-modern period, but as we have to purge our minds in public in a very brief period of time, and as I am a well-known pedant of the old school, for which brief means, unfortunately, more than brief, I have to stop speaking at the present moment. Perhaps this will come up in the questions and answers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jack. And now we turn to Frank Salame, who will be our penultimate speaker.
I'm taking a bent on Ilan's book, different from that of my colleagues on this panel, suggesting the delegitimization of Israel, not only in historical terms, but also in conceptual and linguistic terms, has had a long tradition in the Middle East, predating the modern state of Israel and predating even the Balfour Declaration. This delegitimization issues from an anti-minority bent to Middle Eastern history, the most visible today being, of course, anti-Jewish, but there's predating that there has been, or cohabitating with it, has been an anti-Christian bent, entailing this sort of history of expropriating minority history and minority narratives and minority symbols. Ilan mentions at one point in his book the stated goal of the World Zionist Organization's meeting in Basel in 1897 being securing a Jewish homeland in Palestine. And to my sense, this is the language, specific language, is establishing or securing a Jewish homeland in Palestine, created the territory, even though it did not create the word, but it created the territory that did not exist prior. What the British later on came and called British Mandate Palestine, which included modern-day Jordan, was actually part of the Ottoman states of Beirut and Damascus. There was no such thing as Palestine in an Arabic sense or an Arab national imagination, if you will. So it could be argued that Zionism created Palestine and whispered in the ears of early stirrings of Arab nationalists that zeroed in on this idea. But Palestine is, as in many of Ilan's and Jack's other works, Palestine is a region in the imagination of Westerners, mainly Europeans, and it refers in a very loose sense to what Europeans, mainly Christians, called the Holy Lands in the plural, and Palestine and Palestinian usually meant in that context Jews who were native to that region. So there have been, going back to the idea of expropriation of minority history and minority symbols, there have been over the past century, if you will, 4 or 5 models that minorities have used to deal with their minoritarian status. 4 of those models have failed. One is still standing, but is under attack or has been under attack for the past 80, 90 years or so. The first model I termed the dhimmi model, and this is the model of the Copts of Egypt, who have dealt with their minoritarian status by recognizing it and submitting to the will of the majority. So this is a self-effacement, self-abnegation. The second model is the taqiyya model, which is the dissimulation model, and that's a model that's been used quite skillfully by the Alawites of Syria, who have expropriated elements of Arab nationalism and claimed to be Arab nationalists, and that way they have protected their own self-preservation, if you will. It's a model of the Druze also, who are Arab nationalists in Syria, who are Israeli citizens in Israel, who are in the 1930s and 1940s in Lebanon were Lebanese nationalists, were even Phoenicianists, for those of you who know that intellectual current. The third model is the Janissary model, and that is the model of also maybe called the dhimmi syndrome model, which is the model of the Greek, mainly the Greek Orthodox Christians of the Middle East, who invented the notion of Arab nationalism, invented Arabism, and became its most vociferous and articulate exponents. The fourth model is what I call the Vatican model, because the Vatican, at least in the early 20th century, was playing around with the idea of this conversation of civilizations and cultures and etc. So it threw that model on the Maronites of Lebanon, who very early on in the late 19th and early 20th century were very much behind the Zionist project and were viewed at the time as the Zionists of Eastern Christians and were intent on creating a national home for, not the national home for Eastern Christians, but a national home for the Maronites. But the Vatican played ball with them and suggested this idea of dialogue of civilizations, and they created out of that, instead of creating a national home for the Christians of Lebanon, created this confederation of minorities, also known as a basket case. But it's a dialogue of cultures. The fifth model is the Israel model, is the fortress model, is the minority that decided to build a fortress, a national home for the Jewish people in the Jewish people's ancestral homeland. So on the question of indigeneity and settler colonialism, we tend to abominate colonialism for good reason, especially colonialism of Western provenance or colonialism that is deemed attached to anything Western or white, which incidentally invented the discipline of anti-colonialism or post-colonialism and made amends to its colonialist past. So we abominate this colonialism and we beatify a colonialism that is still a colonialism, but does not recognize itself as a colonialism, does not recognize its colonial history, and does not attempt to make amends on its colonial past, and that is Arab-Muslim colonialism. So the problem from the perspective of Arab-Muslim colonialism that does not recognize itself as a colonialism becomes the colonized of the Middle East, who are actually the indigenous people of the Middle East. And if we want to remain within the context of this kind of language, we could argue that Israel is perhaps modern history's most successful experiment in anti-colonialism or ending colonialism. So the problem from the perspective of Muslim colonialism is the colonized of the Middle East, the non-Muslims of the Middle East. And today, the most visible of those problematic peoples are the Jews who dared to create this fortress. Equally problematic is that, again, relating to this idea of indigeneity and being descendants of such and such Jebusites or Canaanites and so forth. The problem for Arab nationalists and Palestinianism today is the fact that the Jews have survived into modernity with their historical memory intact and can actually make claims of descent from pre-modern peoples. Unlike most other modern peoples who are in modern times claiming descent from pre-modern progenitors, among them my own people, the Lebanese who claim descent from the Phoenicians, another Canaanite people, if you will. The problem is that the Jews were humanity's first literate people, and they actually wrote that history in a book Christians usually call the Old Testament. And so they have survived into modernity with this historical memory intact. And that memory and sapping that memory becomes foundational to the early stirrings of Christian Arab nationalism. Najib Azuri, one of the main ideologues of early Arab nationalism, publishes a book in 1905 titled Le réveil de la nation arabe, the awakening of the Arab nation in Turkish Asia. And in this awakening, he's actually not describing Arab nationalism, but his book is a screed, an anti-Jewish screed, essentially making the case for an anti-Jewish or a Judenrein, a Jewish clean, a Middle East cleansed of Jewish existence.
5 minutes.
In this book, he suggests that the Arab awakening has to, and this goes to the idea of the Greek Orthodox and other Christians having created the idea of Arab nationalism as I mentioned the dhimmi syndrome initially, which is a way for those Christians, of Arabic-speaking Christians, of buying themselves time by becoming anti-Jewish or anti-Semites. So it's essentially a way of asking the executioner for one more second. Let me live, let me survive one more second. I will make your case for you. And that's essentially what Azuri wrote his book in French. He did not write it in Arabic. He did not write it for an Arabic reading audience. He wrote it for a European audience. So he was making the case for Arab nationalism to European audiences, concentrating on or bringing to the fore anti-Semitic tropes that were understandable to Western audiences, but more importantly, understandable to intellectual communities in the Middle East proper that were versed in European languages, and mainly those were Christians. So he begins Le Réveil, the awakening of the Arab nation, with a detailed description of the Jews, not only as, quote, as we have come to know them, as they are in our day, but also as they have come to us through the biblical narrative and their own sacred books. This method, he notes, would spare him the accusations of hysteria and over-exaggeration. But essentially, if you read Azuri's The Awakening of Arab Nationalism, it is entire pages almost taken from the protocols of the elders of Zion. So the idea of delegitimization begins very early on, and in a way, it is contemporaneous with the World Zionist Congress and the beginnings of what some have called political Zionism. That is Zionism that seeks to politically establish a presence rather than the emotive Zionism of centuries or millennia prior, which was a faith-based Zionism that is movement into an establishment and the enrichment of the old Yishuv, if you will, from AD 100 to the early 1800s. And I'll conclude here.
And now we turn to our guest, honored guest, Professor Ilan Troen, for his remarks.
Thank you to the organizers of the conference who thought fit to create this session for my book. Secondly, but very importantly, to those people who actually read the book and have thought well enough or disturbed enough by it to come forward and publicly state their appreciation and criticism and suggestions for it. So I thank you, fellow panelists and friends, and you who are someplace like the Wizard of Oz behind the screen, and I suppose not in Kansas, but in Jerusalem. And thank those of you who have come who curious about this issue of Palestine, of the Holy Land, of Israel, and the problems that I bring forth in the book. Let me just say that I think that it fits within the purview of the Bernard Lewis competition. There are a lot of reasons for doing so. Is because as I read Lewis, Lewis is devoted to nuance. One of the things that disturbs me in looking at or having taught the conflict both in Israel, but most particularly in the United States, and I'd like to explain why this book would not have been written had I stayed only in Israel. It was a book that was product of the years I spent in Brandeis, and where I had the privilege of having students like Robert and Umut and about 300 plus others who came at the Summer Institute, and David and Miles, and also more than a dozen graduate students, most of whom were not Jewish. This book would not have been written had I not encountered the diversity of people I found in the United States and the people who came from all over the world, who I discovered had questions about the conflict that were very different, in many cases, than those of my students in Israel, as varied as they would be. And I had, in the same seminar, I'd have a Russian immigrant who was somewhat to the right. I had kibbutzniks who were to the left. I had Bedouins. I had the bourgeois from North Tel Aviv. And all of them fit the stereotypes of different views of what was right and wrong, and did so passionately about their country. But it was something about coming out to this country and meeting a different set of students who were asking different questions. And later on, when I went out to Asia, I discovered that it wasn't the Middle East, it was actually the Western Asian studies. And that only enhanced my sense of the diversity of ways in which people looked at this conflict which consumes so much of our attention. Geography, culture, place really matter, and what you really want to know, or what people want to know, varies enormously. So that made me begin to think that what was I doing? Was it right? I also was the founding editor of a journal called Israel Studies, and in my years as the chief editor, I encountered 600 articles that I published and many more that were submitted. And let me tell you, is that there was an enormous amount of diverse curiosity about this very small place, relatively very small place. Well then, if nuance becomes essential, how does one begin to get into it? And we've had some, I've heard some very useful comments here. You're all right in saying that I'm fixed on the issue of legitimacy. In fact, the initial title of the book would have been something like Contested Legitimacy, the First Century. So, so the voice from Jerusalem, this is, I do not see end of conflict. I really see this as a contribution to understanding something that will be ongoing and is far from being resolved. And I am not trying to resolve it, rather than trying to provide the outlines for understanding the issue. Well, how to understand the issue? It was enormously beneficial that it turned out that one of my neighbors living in Brookline, rather than in the Negev, was Peter Berger, one of the great scholars of Boston University, who adopted me somehow, to my great fortune, and introduced me into a seminar that lasted several years, where he was working out why he was wrong. In the 1960s, he was the great sociologist of religion who argued that modernity inexorably, inevitably, leads to secularization. When I met him around 2010, he had come to realize that that was just incorrect, is that religion still can thrive in allegedly secular societies. And that was even before he saw the transfer of the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem, with the invocation given by Pastor Jeffries with his 20,000 megachurch from San Antonio, and the final benediction by Pastor Hagee, who also runs a megachurch and the single largest organization, pro-Israel organization in the United States, called Kufi. And examples from all over the world. And then one could read the Walzer book on secular revolutions and religious counter-revolutions, and ask the question, how do you explain that India became a modern state under Nehru, a thoroughly secular, westernized individual, but is now being torn again by religious impulses? Or Algeria, Ben Bella, Ben Bella would be voted in as the head of Algeria today? Or what kind of voting coalition would bring Ben-Gurion into power today in Israel? Not one that exists. Or almost the first time I came to Turkey, the question that was asked to me by 5 different universities was, give me 5 different lecture topics, and they all chose the same one, which was, can Israel be both a Jewish and democratic state? But what they really wanted to know was, could Turkey be the kind of state that the Kemalists imagined that it could be? This was just as Erdogan's party was coming in. So that religion is real. And it has not been extirpated, even in the most modern societies, whether it's America or societies throughout the world. So if that's a mode of analysis, then one has to rethink the beginning of Zionism. In 1917, the Balfour Declaration. Well, what a shock that was in history of not only Western and Middle Eastern civilizations. For 1,300 years, Islam ruled it, aside maybe for two centuries of intermittent Christian rule. For 1,600 years, Christians had an imagination of who ought to rule it. And all of a sudden, a British Christian empire, whose cabinet happened to have been largely evangelical or fundamentalist Protestant, decide that this land is to be given to the Jews as a Jewish national homeland? How does that work? Very poorly, very difficult. It requires the adjustment of religious civilizations, national cultures, all kinds of politics. What becomes the relationship between theology, which until the 20th century is dormant in the discourse about Palestine as terra sancta, the holy land for all the traditions, when you have to go to the League of Nations and then the United Nations. So, Yael, if you read the official history of the Palestine-Israeli conflict in the website of the Secretariat of the United Nations, written between 1977 and roughly finished 15 years later, produced, I think it's 400 pages, you will discover that among the Palestinians and the Israelis, there are no Jews, no Christians, and no Muslims. The Mufti is only a Palestinian patriot. Ben-Gurion is merely a local political leader. In short, there is a total abhorrence, avoidance of the religious drives that characterize these people, either in their affirmation or in their contradiction of their own identity. That's only the beginning. In short, the problem becomes, and that's the problem of the book, describe what the modern secular bases for ascertaining legitimacy are, then take a look at what is taking place in the traditional monotheistic religions, which are all, including Judaism, supersessionist, and understand that, Abraham and Terach is supersessionism, if you like. Yeah, you can go back that far, Richard, and you ought to. We're going to find it next week in the portion of the week. And in any case, is that the religious discourse was stagnant until the need to speak in public in the public square. And a lot of options began to develop. And my concern was, what is the tangle? Because after all, Christianity has within it many traditions. It's not only the Pope, it's not only Eastern Orthodox, but without people like Parkes in England or Reinhold Niebuhr in the United States, it is very difficult to imagine large sections of the public coming to support Zionism. And we focused earlier on Islam, the Mahmoud Abbases, the Arafats, who came with a fatwa, a hechsher, a document that gave him a theological basis for making peace in Jerusalem, no more war. He could not have come to Jerusalem without a kind of theological justification, of authorization for doing what he had done. And you begin to, when you work that out and schematize it, Islam is becoming increasingly rich. Christianity has long been very diverse, not only in its churches, but through its Protestant denominations, with its many hundreds of denominations. And Judaism itself, Zionism, was a minority position within the Jewish world in 1917. The Reform were against it. It's the Pittsburgh Platform. And one can go on. You know, when does Zionism become the majority view of the Jews of the world? And so on. So that religions have many different threads. There are many different threads within secular discourse. How does this work? One example, which I enjoyed using, is that the single largest debate during the mandate was over the economic absorptive capacity of Palestine, for which an unbelievable number and diversity of scholars from archaeology, history, geology, economics, you name it, were all involved. And the British ultimately chose, we couldn't have too many Jews there. Was that a scientific judgment, or was that influenced by politics and prejudice? There were 700,000 people in Palestine at the time of the Balfour Declaration. There are 14 million people there today. It grew by 20 times in the last century. So the scientific argument we know, but the debate took place over all kinds of preconceptions and biases and preferences, political, theological, historical, you name it, over what that country had once looked like and what it might look like in the future. So the secular theological is complicated. I use the word tangle. There is a tangle between the theological and the secular, and both the secular and the theological have multiple strands. My fascination is with how does that work? And one of the examples that I would use, and I'm so glad it was picked up by my colleagues, was the notion of colonial settler, which for me is but, and for many, is but a secular statement of supersessionism. The Jews exited from history. To use the word of a great historian, Toynbee, who was very influential in the thought of Edward Said, who also was a friend of Antonius, believed that Jews were fossils. They had exited history. Well, that's a theological notion that can become secularized in the manifest charts that Toynbee uses to illustrate his history of mankind. So colonial settler itself may be a social science term, but it can also be a theological term. When you say Jewish land or Arab land, what language are you using, secular or religious language? And I did not see, and I do not see, my work as the final work on this whole complex, fascinating issue. I really see it as a way of opening up a question and inviting other people to investigate all the possibilities of the tangles, of the multiple strands, of how it is over the last century people have woven different fabrics from the warp and the woof, which is the cultural, intellectual, political, human struggle for the same land, which has many indigenous people, which has people with many different historical pasts. And something I've certainly learned from Jack Lasner is the importance of pasts, both real and, very importantly, imagined, how that works as we as historians try to do our work and make the world that we see more understandable. So that's what this is about. It's really an attempt to prod people to say that there may be yet another way, aside from social science paradigms, or aside from just studying fanaticism in this religious tradition and fanaticism in that religious tradition, is that somehow try to imagine both concurrently and look for the variety, the nuance, the realities, the obscenities of the past, and the possibilities of the future. And let me just say the following, and I'll end with this, and it's very personal. The book was finished before October 7th. I pulled it from the publisher on October 8th, and dedicated to my daughter and son-in-law who were murdered on their kibbutz, Cholit, on the Gaza border. And I dedicated it to them because they were typical of those people who saw possibilities. They were partners in inventing a multicultural, multilingual school in Arabic and in Hebrew for the people who live in Israel, and particularly in their part of Israel. They had chosen to live in the Negev rather than in the Judea, Samaria, West Bank, Palestine, whatever you wish to call it, because they thought that was a place where one could fulfill certain kinds of Zionist aspirations. And they really represented many of the people who lived in that part of Israel and who were massacred on October 7th. And I know for a fact that they would have resented stereotyping fellow Israelis, and that they would resent and object to the stereotyping of the people who lived on the other side of the border. And it was they who were committed to nurturing nuance. And this notion of nurturing nuance and possibilities, it seems to me to be terribly important, and is probably the only way forward, if there is a way forward, in living in the kind of bind that those of us who actually live there live through. So that's what the book begins as something very personal, trying to understand what my students are telling me by their many different questions, to being informed by academics and colleagues, all of you people here sitting at this table, not just Jack, all of you people sitting at this table, and many of you people out there, the students and people I've published and as the editor of a journal, to the reality of my children and the world that they wish to live in, which would be a world of diversity and of hope and of respect. So of all the models, Frank, Israel is a fortress, but it didn't have to be a fortress. That the first settlements established by Zionist pioneers had no walls. Walls came up in the 1920s. Arnon Golan is here and can tell you that the early Moshavot did not have really walls. If you see the maps of Rehovot, these are streets like Chicago in 1830. They went on ad infinitum. There was no sense that we would be living in a ghetto. Possibilities were there. And that earliest discussion was over the word offentlich, which translates out as, shall the Zionist movement in Basel adopt 4 principles and state them openly? A minority said, no, you must rely upon the great philanthropist, rely upon as a Hofjudah, rely upon the ruler, rely upon the authoritarian, rely upon the people who can dictate what the future is. The majority said no. We want to have a state that is offentlich, meaning it is publicly defensible, that it has public acclaim, that it is not a fortress. The struggle for legitimacy is built into the very roots of the Zionist enterprise, and it is a struggle which is now entering its 2nd century under the burden of all the deeds and misdeeds that have taken place in the 1st century. So thank you.